10 had going for it was it had these gigantic singles that sounded amazing on the radio. Like, I know that when they went back and remastered that record, they kind of switched around the production a little bit, and it's debatable whether or not it actually improves it. But I think, to me, and obviously you'd never know this because who would broadcast those songs on radio now, but I have a feeling that the new production would sound less good coming through, you know, a transistor radio in 1991. When
people look at 10, one thing that's important to remember is that 10 broke as an album, not in Seattle. It broke across the United States through FM radio stations, essentially at the same time, and through MTV videos. They had a huge role in making that record a hit.
It sounds like classic rock radio and became classic rock radio. It sounds like something that had a lot of stuff on it that was easygoing and yet had some passion to it. It was something that it sounded good. It was mixed to sound good. It was mixed to sound like something that you could just put on. Just imagine yourself just listening to in hallways, driving around in your car, doing whatever.
When we mixed that record, the music at the time was still very rock-driven. There was still a lot of bands like your Tesla and Warrant and all those sort of things around. So nobody was afraid of things like reverb and making things sound big. Later, the grunge sound became more about being honest and dry and natural. So when I was mixing 10, I wasn't really afraid to use all the colors that were available to me. And when I heard the music, I really wanted it to be a deep, emotive sound because I felt that there was a lot going on in that music that could be brought out. And because it was very much a performance recording, there was a lot of room to try reverse reverb or a delay here or a reverb there. And that was my intention.
The thing that made them great immediately and that attracted people to them immediately was that, you know, you heard the opening riff to Alive, and it sounded simultaneously like it was something fresh and totally new and, you know, and totally great and anthemic, but it also sounded like it could be a classic rock song. Like, it sounded like something that was also comfortable and familiar and, you know, something that you know, could play, spot the influence, and you kind of knew where it was coming from. I think that's why rock fans felt better about getting behind Pearl Jam, because it felt like a smoother transition than something as abrasive as Nevermind.
Story for you. What you thought was your daddy was nothing but
The thing with not only Pearl Jam, but all those grunge bands at the time, again, they were a complete reaction to what was prevalent prior to them, you know, your Guns N' Roses type bands. They, I think, were a little more gritty and weren't afraid to speak their mind. They were a little more thought-provoking with their lyrics. And it was, I think, why it became so popular, the whole grunge thing. A lot of the younger music fans, and they could really relate to what Eddie Vedder was saying, and also what Kurt Cobain was saying, and also Chris Cornell.
Because it's music being used as a vehicle for something where you have a sense of a band really playing together, a sense of a band actually just, you know, going out and just, you know, hey man, this is real, this is us. This whole idea of the image on the front cover, of them all just sort of like, we're a unit, we're doing this, that whole thing, this whole ethos, it's one of those things that it can strike people almost as false because it seems too good to be true. It seems like, okay, it's almost like the, yeah, you know, us against the world, here we all are, this is what I'm saying from my heart.
And I think that music fans could relate to that more than, say, your Vince Neils of the world or whoever, you know, where it's a guy traveling around in a limo, you know, there's such a difference between him up on a stage and, say, like, you know, Kurt Cobain or, like, you know, Eddie Vedder, who could just be a guy who was waiting in line to go see a Black Flag show.
sorry I didn't see him, but I'm glad we saw. Oh, I'm still alive. Yeah. Oh, I'm still alive. Yeah. Oh, I'm still alive. Yeah.
The thing about many of those songs from 10, but particularly Alive, is we didn't really know what it was about. And this is the way most music works. It is defined by your experience of it, not necessarily the songwriter's experience of it. But in this case, the particular biographical dimensions of Alive would remain shrouded for years. It was a very personal, very intense, very pointed song by Eddie Vedder, who had grown up believing that a man who he would find out was his stepfather was his biological father. And in point of fact, he'd met his biological father, didn't know that he was anything other than a friend of the family. The song is a lament in anthem form.
He was able to put these images, these thoughts, these stories into something that actually struck a chord. And he was able to do so in a way that both drew on his own experiences, and he's been very open about which songs in particular have been the most autobiographical. Alive is a very good example. And he's also been able to draw them on experiences of others. Jeremy is another classic example from that album, of things that had happened in life, tragic situations. Melodramatic? They can be, so a lot of the songs are, but he found a vehicle that satisfies him to be able to get these thoughts out, these things that he's been working on for years.
The combination of Vedder's poetic, observational and biographical lyrics, combined with the old-school rock edge of Gossard and Ament's music, helped Ten gain a vital foothold across the United States. With drummer Dave Crewson being replaced by Dave Abruzzese, Pearl Jam's success was steadily building as they set out on their supporting tour. Although singles from the album were not being released domestically, both Alive and Even Flow were met with steady commercial and critical success overseas. At home, despite strong interest, the public, and most importantly, members of the Seattle music fraternity, greeted Pearl Jam with caution, some unsure as to whether they would be able to sustain such an initial impact, while others began to question their legitimacy as an authentic grunge act.
You know, to be perfectly honest, at the time, 10 was a very, very difficult album to understand. It's an album that explained itself on the radio, song by song, when it arrived as an album from a band I'd never heard of because I was in New York. I didn't know who, really? They're not one of the Seattle bands I heard of. And you know, you had heard of other bands. It's not just that Nirvana had put out a record beforehand. They toured relentlessly leading up to Nevermind. And I had a Nirvana album at home. I had 7-inch singles by Nirvana at home. I'd seen Soundgarden probably a half a dozen times. But in the mail, this record comes by Pearl Jam. Doesn't sound like a very grungy punk name. Didn't sound like a very grungy punk band. Didn't really cohere for me.
It was a big album in Seattle. It definitely sold a lot in Seattle, but it wasn't like Seattle made that band. And some of these other bands out of this area, Seattle made them a star to start with. With Pearl Jam, there almost was a reaction within Seattle because it was like they became big without our blessing.
They made a big mistake. They didn't go further and find more of the bands that were already here and had been here even before the bands that were exploited were. You know, that's what it makes me feel guilty of the success of our band, because it should have been spread out to the success of like a number of bands here.
They became so big so fast that they outran Seattle's support in it to a degree. And I think that explains a little bit of the odd relationship Seattle and other members of Seattle bands always had with Pearl Jam.
One of the most notable criticisms to be aimed at Pearl Jam came from Nirvana's Kurt Cobain, who called the band a commercial sellout, and this led to a reported feud between the two frontmen.
The feud between Eddie Vedder and Kurt Cobain that got written up in a few magazines and got a lot of attention really wasn't a feud. Basically what happened was that Kurt Cobain said a couple of things to a couple